Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I have a pretty well-known true crime story for you. This one's a case I've known about for a long time, and I've thought about covering since pretty much the beginning. It's the story of Charles Whitman and why on August 1st, 1966, he decided to end the lives of 14 people. On this day, he went up to the observation deck of the main building tower at the University of Texas at Austin and rained terror on the people below. Growing up in Dallas, I've been to Austin many times. I've seen UTA many times, and I've had friends live there and go to the school. It's crazy to think about something like this happening. Hopefully you enjoy this story. Charles Whitman was born in Lake Worth, Florida on June 24th, 1941. He had two younger brothers, and at the age of 6, Charles had his IQ tested. The results came back at 139. And this is just a fact. I'm not stating an opinion over this. It's something that every single article I read brings up, so I have to say it as well. Charles was said to have been a gifted student. He was a pianist and an Eagle Scout. He was raised by his father, Charles Adolphus Whitman, and his mother, Margaret. His father was a plumber, and he considered himself a self-made man who worked his way up to the top of his profession. He was known to be a very strict dad and ran his house with an iron fist. He says that even though he loved her, he would knock around his wife when she got stubborn. He also took out his anger on his three sons, whether it was with belts, paddles, or even fists. This was to ensure that all of his sons complied to his rules. We're going to refer to the father of this story as C.A. Whitman from now on. He went by this, but also it will get confusing if I call him Charles as well. And one thing about C.A. Whitman was that he provided very well for his family. Like I said earlier, he worked his way up to the top of his profession, and he made a good living. He was able to work his way into high privileged inner circles. Not sure if that's the correct term, but he was hanging out with some pretty high people, supposedly. He gave his sons motorcycles, firearms, and a whole bunch of gifts that the boys enjoyed very much. I'm sure this made CA feel like he could do whatever he wanted within the home. He could treat his family however he saw fit because he was king in his eyes. On July 6, 1959, Charles Whitman left for basic training in the U.S. Marine Corps. This decision had cropped up into Charles's mind about a month before he actually left. One night in June 1959, CA came home drunk after a crazy night out with the boys. Something set him off and he beat Charles really bad, and then he threw him into the pool. Charles was soon to be 18 years old, and it seems like this was the final straw for Charles because he applied for enlistment only a few days later. Charles was originally stationed with the Marines at the Guantanamo Naval Base in Cuba. It appears that his strict, almost military-like upbringing would come in handy while he was in the Marines. He had been living under the strict rule of his father for so long, and he worked really hard at being a good Marine. He earned a Good Conduct Medal, the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal, and a Sharpshooter's Badge. Something that will, of course, come up later was how well of a marksman Charles was. He scored 215 out of the 250 on his shooting tests. He was also very good at shooting from long distance, and he seemed to excel at shooting moving targets. And, everyone around him would say how good of a Marine he was and how good of a marksman he was. And it makes a lot of sense why both of those things are true. He grew up receiving firearms as gifts and going shooting with his brothers a lot. And he, like I said earlier, he is such a good Marine because he is wanting to prove himself to his father. And also his father raised him in a very strict household, so he fits right into that. And he never really got approval from his father, so I think he is now trying to make up for that for the first time in his life. And it's actually working so far. He seems to be making a name for himself in the Marines, and he applied for the Naval Enlisted Science Education Program. This was a scholarship program that would supposedly train enlisted men to become engineers. I can't actually find a ton of info about how that works, so if you know anything, let me know in the comments, please. But Charles took a very competitive exam to get this scholarship, and he was actually chosen for it. If he would go through and finish this, he would earn an engineering degree, and then he would go to the Officers Candidate School to become an officer after he finishes his degree. His books and tuition and everything would be paid for by the Marines, and he would also receive an additional $250 a month, which is about $2,000 adjusted for inflation in 2020. At this point, it really looks like Charles is on a path to success. He's doing really well in the Marines. He just earned this prestigious scholarship that is paying for him to become an engineer and an officer in the Marines. And on top of that, they're basically paying for him to live while he's doing this. And obviously, the Marines and Charles himself see a bright and opportunistic future. On September 15th, 1961, Charles was admitted to the University of Texas in Austin to continue working towards this future he saw for himself. However, this change would come with trouble. Like I said, Charles was raised in a very disciplinary household, and that sort of lifestyle continued when he joined the Marines. But all of a sudden, he had freedom. Sure, he had to attend classes, but everything else about his life was completely different than it had ever been. It seems like now that he had freedom, he didn't know how to control himself. He started getting into trouble with friends, getting arrested for poaching deer. He was racking up gambling debts, and he refused to pay them. And on top of this, he wasn't doing very well in school. One interesting thing to note is Charles and a friend of his named Francis were walking through the bookstore in the main building on campus, and Charles mentioned to Francis that, quote, a person could stand off an army from atop of it before they got him. He was talking about the tower. The same tower that in 4 years' time, Charles would find himself aiming his Remington 700 ADL bolt-action rifle down onto the street looking for victims. In February 1962, Charles met Kathleen Frances Leisner. Kathleen would become his first real girlfriend, and they would get married after dating for only 5 months. This was met with approval from Kathleen's friends and family, as they saw Charles as a handsome, lovely young man with a bright future. However, as I said before, Charles's grades started dropping, and about a year after he was married, Charles had his scholarship withdrawn, and he was made to return to active duty. This is where everything would start to fall apart in his life. Going back to active duty means Charles was stationed in Camp Lejeune, and if I didn't pronounce that right, please let me know, because I've seen mixed things on how to pronounce Lejeune. And it wasn't going as well this time. He had spent a year and a half with total freedom, and all of a sudden he was thrown back into the disciplinary lifestyle that was the Marines. He was lonely, and he wasn't with his wife. His wife was back in Austin, and he was told that the time he spent in Austin didn't go towards his overall enlistment time, and that he wouldn't be able to get his scholarship back. In November of 1963, Charles was court-martialed for gambling, usury, and for the possession of an unauthorized non-military weapon. He was found guilty and sentenced to 30 days confinement and 90 days of hard labor. He was stripped of a promotion he had received, which made him go from lance corporal to private. After all of this, his resentment for the Marines really started to show. He eventually turned to his father for help, as his father had made some connections through his business over the years. His father was able to get a year knocked off of his time in the Marines, and Charles was honorably discharged at the end of 1964. After he was discharged from the Marines, he went back to Austin to live with his wife. At the start of their marriage, Charles took the only father figure examples he had and applied that to his marriage. This was, of course, to become violent with his wife. This time, however, he was determined to not be that way. So basically, when they first got married, before things started to fall apart, he was very violent with his wife. He would beat her. He would hit her. I don't think it was as bad necessarily, but it doesn't really matter. He still hit her, so it's really bad. But this time, he was going to try his hardest to be a caring and loving husband. Charles has had some major up and downs in his life so far. And coming off of the failure as a Marine and as a university student, he was determined to turn it around. He changed his degree from mechanical engineering to architectural engineering. He re-enrolled at UT Austin. Between the time he was discharged in '64 and the shooting in '66, Charles worked multiple jobs while in school. He worked as a bill collector, as a bank teller, and as a traffic surveyor for the Texas Highway Department. During this time, he was also a scout leader for Austin Scout Troop No. 5. Kathy was the breadwinner of the house during this time. She worked as a biology teacher for a high school in Austin, and Charles' income mostly supplemented hers, which was something that he didn't really like very much. At the same time, Charles was still in contact with his father, and he was receiving money and gifts from him. It seems like Charles really began to hate himself during this time. He saw himself as a freeloader and a loser who didn't accomplish anything worthwhile since he actually left home. He also thought that being overweight was a weakness, and he was a little bit overweight. So I guess he looks at himself as being weak. In the spring of 1966, Charles' parents finally divorced. They had had another big fight, and Margaret said, enough is enough. Charles traveled to Florida to help his mother, and his brother Patrick moved to Austin. Of course, this did nothing to help relieve the depression and anxiety that Charles was feeling. And this was something that his wife noticed, as you would. She was able to convince him to seek help. Charles saw Dr. Jan D. Cochran, and she prescribed him Valium, and she referred him to psychiatrist Dr. Maurice Heatley. Dr. Heatley and Charles talked about his failures, about his hatred for his father, and Charles actually mentioned his thoughts of going up to the tower and shooting people, but the doctor was not too worried about it. So what do you think about that? He says that nothing indicated that Charles was serious about it, and that many of his patients had made references to the tower. I don't know for sure about what that means exactly, like references to the tower. I mean, is he getting a lot of people coming into his office saying that they want to go up to the tower and shoot people? Or are they just talking about the tower a lot? I'm not really sure about that. But like I said earlier, the conversation he had had in the library, this wasn't the first time Charles had brought up the tower to someone. And he had actually brought up the tower in that sort of way multiple times in the past, and no one actually took him seriously. After the session with Dr. Heatley, they never saw each other again, and Charles was supposed to call the office the next week, but he never did. But this is pretty weird. It's something that I'll bring up at the end, I believe. Look, I can sort of see where he's coming from. And I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychiatrist, so it's hard for me to say, this doctor didn't do the right thing. But because he says that nothing indicated that Charles actually wanted to do it, that maybe it was just something that he had thought about. But at the same time, it's pretty, it happened. So something is there. Let me know in the comments what you think about that. It's pretty crazy. It's one of the weirdest things of this case, in my opinion. But that was in the spring of 1966. And in the summer of 1966, shortly before Charles would go on his spree, he began abusing the amphetamine dexedrine. This was able to help him get through school and work, and he sometimes went days without sleeping. He was trying really hard to excel in school, taking an even heavier course load than he was before. But the drug he was taking was making him more inefficient. Obviously, he wasn't sleeping for days. You're never going to be efficient if you go days without sleeping, so get good sleep. As a result of this, instead of excelling at school, he began to fail at it again. This would cause his self-esteem to continue to drop and his hatred of himself to continue to rise. His friends and family could all see what was going on, but none of them had any idea what kind of violence Charles was heading to, and that his thoughts and fantasies of killing were consuming him even more. The day before the shooting, Charles came up with the plan. He bought a Bowie knife and binoculars from a surplus store, and he bought some canned meat from 7-Eleven. He would end up taking these things and more up to the tower with him. He and Kathleen hung out after she got off work early in the afternoon from her part-time job, and they saw a movie, and they saw a couple friends of theirs. Everything seemed pretty normal. Their friends would say that Charles was unusually quiet, but of course they didn't suspect anything. Maybe he was just down a little bit. At around 6 p.m., Kathleen had another shift and left Charles alone. Charles began to write out a letter explaining everything that he was planning on doing. I'm going to read part of the letter that I can find, or at least that I can actually read, and I'll also put up pictures of the letter on the screen right now. But from when I say quote is his actual letter. So quote,
I don't quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter, Perhaps it is to leave some vague reason for the actions I have recently performed. I don't really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, and I can't recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks. In March, when my parents made a physical break, I noticed a great deal of stress. I consulted a Dr. Cochran at the University Health Center and asked him to recommend someone that I could consult with about some psychiatric disorders I felt I had. I talked with the doctor once for about 2 hours and tried to convey to him my fears that I felt come overwhelming, violent impulses. After one session, I never saw the doctor again. And since then, I have been fighting my mental turmoil alone and seemingly to no avail. After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there's any visible physical disorder. I have had some tremendous headaches in the past and have consumed 2 large bottles of Excedrin in the past 3 months. It was after much thought that I decided to kill my wife, Kathy, tonight after I pick her up from work at the telephone company. I love her dearly, and she has been as fine a wife to me as any man could ever hope to have. I cannot rationally pinpoint any specific reason for doing this. I don't know whether it is selfishness or if I don't want her to have to face the embarrassment my actions would surely cause her. At this time, though, the prominent reason in my mind is that I truly do not consider this world worth living in and am prepared to die, and I do not want to leave her to suffer alone in it. I intend to kill her as painlessly as possible. Similar reasons provoked me to take my mother's life also. I don't think the poor woman has ever enjoyed life as she is entitled to. She was a simple young woman who married a very possessive and dominating man.
While Charles was writing the letter, he received a visit by two of their friends named Larry and Eileen. They hung out for a while and talked. Charles told them stories and talked about buying land on Canyon Lake and told sentimental stories of him and Kathleen. He said to them twice, I quote,
It's a shame that she should have to work all day and then come home too.
end quote. But he didn't finish that sentence. If he did finish the sentence, I'd assume he would say, and then come home to die. The three of them ate ice cream together and they left around 8:30 that night. Around 9:30 that night, Charles went and picked up Kathleen from her work, and they were back home shortly. Charles called his mom and asked if they could come over to her apartment, but Kathleen didn't want to go. She stayed back, and Charles went over to his mom's around midnight. His mom met Charles in the lobby of her apartment building, and they went up to her apartment. And once they were inside, Charles attacked his mother and strangled her to death from behind with a rubber hose, and then stabbed her in the chest with a hunting knife. It also appears that he hit her over the back of the head with a large object, although no autopsy was ever performed on her, so I can't find exact details. His mother was dead by 12:30. He wrote another letter explaining that he had just taken his mother's life and that he was very upset over it, but that he'd done it to end her sufferings. I mean, basically, yeah. Yeah. He says that she is suffering because she married an abusive husband and now she's divorced, which is she's probably happy. I mean, maybe she's sad, sure, a little bit, but she's gotten out of an abusive relationship, so it seems like her future is probably bright. She's in a new city, a new place. Maybe it's a little scary, but she's finally got out of this abusive relationship she's been in for decades. So he wasn't ending her suffering, but that's the excuse he used. He then wrote another note. It read, Roy, I don't have to be at work today, and I was up late last night. I would like to get some rest. Please do not disturb me. Thank you, Miss Whitman. This was left on the front door to her apartment and was meant for the building houseman. It was left to delay the finding of her body. Charles left the apartment building at around 1:30 in the morning, but came back shortly after. He told the doorman that he had forgotten something in her apartment. He was let in and came back down about 5 minutes later with a pill bottle in his hand. He left at 2 a.m. This pill bottle was most likely for Dexedrine, but yeah, it's hard to say. When he got home, Kathleen was asleep in their bed, and Charles came into the room, pulled back the covers off of his wife, and stabbed her in the chest 5 times. He then went on to finish the letter he had been typing. This was around 3 a.m., and he finished the letter with a pen. And he went on about how his father was to blame for their deaths and that somehow he was helping them by doing this. That he did it without them suffering at all. But remember this. I mean, look, Kathleen was sleeping when she was stabbed. Charles's mother was not sleeping. So she definitely did suffer. And for all we know, Kathleen did too. I mean, who knows? But after this, he prepared for the killing spree that he would conduct in only a few hours. Charles put together all the supplies he would need while he was up in the tower into his marine footlocker. This included a hatchet, a hammer, gasoline, multiple gallons of water, a compass, a notebook and a pen, canned food, 2 knives, a flashlight with batteries, a radio, coffee, Dexedrine, Excedrin, and a few other small things he thought he would need. As far as weapons, Whitman packed into his footlocker a Remington 700 6mm bolt-action hunting rifle, a 35 caliber pump rifle, an M1 carbine, a 9mm Luger pistol, a 25 caliber pistol, a Smith & Wesson M19 357 Magnum revolver, and as well as more than 700 rounds of ammunition. That morning, he would also buy 2 more weapons, which were a 30 caliber M1 carbine and a 12-gauge shotgun. He had sawn off the barrel and buttstock off the shotgun, and he had packed all of this into his footlocker as well. And hopefully I said all that right. I'm not a very knowledgeable weapons person. If I said something wrong, let me know. It's not a big deal. But he was very serious about this. I mean, this is so much ammunition, so many weapons. He was not messing around, and it's sad, but he was very serious about it. At 5:45 a.m., he called Kathleen's employer and told them that she was sick and couldn't come in that day. At 7:15 a.m., he went to Austin Rental Company and rented a 2-wheel dolly. He would use this to transport the footlocker, as it was, obviously it was extremely heavy. After this, he went and bought the 2 additional weapons I mentioned a minute ago. At 10:30 a.m., he called his mother's employer and gave the same story he gave Kathleen's, that she was sick and wouldn't be coming into work. At 11 a.m., Charles put his footlocker into his car and took off for the campus. He put on blue overalls, and with the large footlocker he had and the dolly and his overalls, it was designed to make him look like maybe he was a normal maintenance man on campus, and no one would get suspicious. He showed a carrier identification card to the campus security at 11:30 when he arrived, and he was parked and was entering the main tower at 11:35. When he arrived at the elevator, he found that it didn't work, but an employee named Vera Palmer was able to activate it and let him go up. Supervising the 28th floor observation deck was Edna Townsley. Her shift was supposedly going to end in only 20 minutes, but Charles struck her in the back of the head and drug her across the room and hit her behind the couch. Instead of getting off work at noon that day, she died hours later. Charles pushed a desk in front of the door leading to the observation deck, but some people were about to try and come in, and this is when everything really starts. MJ and Mary Gabor, their 2 sons Mark and Mike, and William and Marguerite Lampert were trying to come in. I guess they were coming up to, go to the observation deck. Mark and Mike were able to somewhat push the desk away and look into the room, as they were all confused as to why they couldn't get in. And at this point, Charles rushed at them and shot at them with his sawed-off shotgun. Mark died instantly. Charles shot 3 more times down the hallway, and Marguerite was killed, as was Mary Gabor and her son Mike. William and MJ ran off to get help. As they made their way down the tower, everyone in the tower on the lower floors started to understand what was going on and barricaded themselves into rooms. Charles unloaded his footlocker, wedged the door shut again with the dolly, and immediately began firing. Charles began with his scoped 6mm rifle. His first victim was 18-year-old and pregnant Claire Wilson. She was with her friend and acquaintance Thomas Ekman, and when she was hit in the abdomen, she cried out, and Thomas asked what was wrong. He was then shot in the chest and died immediately. And Claire also died, and so did her unborn child. Next was Dr. Robert Hamilton Boyer, who was a physics professor. He took a bullet in the lower back and died quickly. All around the tower, people began falling, and everyone in the buildings nearby started to notice. Around 12 p.m., the campus police arrived and went up the tower. Again, this was the campus police. This was very early on in the event, and what they could do definitely was limited by the resources they had. They made sure the elevators were shut off and they secured the exits. They believed there had to be multiple people up top, considering how much fire was coming down and how many people were being hit. Charles was still completely unhindered in his ability to take control of the situation and continued to fire below.
Good evening. One of history's worst mass murders occurred here in Austin today. By official count tonight, 49 persons were hit by gunfire. There are 16 dead and 33 injured.
He went for the westward side of the tower, which looked down on Guadalupe Street. It was a very, very busy street, a ton of businesses along the side of the street. And there he gunned down Alex Hernandez, a newspaper boy on a bike, and Karen Griffin, who was 17 years old. He also hit Thomas Carr in the back, who appeared to be attempting to help Griffin. All three died. Austin police were starting to arrive on campus and trying to figure out a game plan to get up the tower, but honestly, it was really, really hard. And really what I mean by game plan to get up the tower, it was more of a game plan to actually figure out, should they go up right away, or should they try and take him or them down, whoever it is, up the tower, because at this point they don't know from the street below. They're just trying to figure out how to do this. Billy Speed, which by the way is a really cool name, Billy Speed, right? He was an officer that was with another officer named Jerry Culp. They were there and they were standing under a statue south of the tower. And Charles shot Billy through a space of 6 inches between two balusters, which were part of a rail that was basically around the statue, if you can picture that in your head. Unfortunately, Billy was killed. And after this, Charles took another 4 down on Guadalupe Street. The 4 were Harry Walchuk, Paul Sontag, Claudio Rutt, and Carla Sue. Obviously, at this point, everyone knew what was going on, even if they didn't know exactly who was doing this and how many people were involved. So police began returning fire from the ground as Charles rose to take shots. Citizens went home and got their guns as well, determined to get into the fight and stop whoever was up there. Police officers eventually would figure out ways of making it to the tower and making it up. Officers Jerry Day, Houston McCoy, Ramiro Martinez, W.A. Cohen, and civilian Alan Crum, and a few others were able to make their way up to the 27th floor. They cleared the floor and got Mary and Mike Gabor's bodies off the floor. Martinez and Crum moved into the reception area with McCoy and Day shortly behind. Martinez kicked the door to the deck, but it was wedged shut, obviously. He kicked it a few more times until the dolly fell and the door was free. Ramirez made his way onto the deck and slowly began crawling to the northwest corner where he thought the shots were coming from. McCoy was behind him, and Crum and Day guarded the door. When Martinez was in the northwest corner, he came around it and started firing his .38 caliber. Charles went to return fire, but he wasn't quick enough. McCoy, who was behind Martinez, shot Charles twice with his shotgun, hitting him in the head and the upper body. Somehow Charles was still alive, so Martinez took McCoy's weapon and ended it. In the end, 14 people lost their lives, and dozens more came close and were injured. It lasted for 90 minutes. Soon, Charles's name was all over nationwide television and news bulletins. Kathleen's father heard this and contacted the Austin police. A car was sent to the residence, and 2 officers came into the house through a window and discovered Kathleen's body. With finding the notes, they were led to Charles' mother's apartment and found her as well around 3 p.m. Shortly after all of this, it was found out that Charles had seen once Dr. Heatley. With this, the doctor had to disclose all of the information and records that he had on Charles. And because Charles had disclosed his fantasy of killing people from the tower, the doctor came under a lot of scrutiny for how he handled the situation. However, he was never charged with anything or found responsible for the killings in any way. I asked this earlier, but what do you think about this? This is insane. Look, it's really weird. It's, he was only one of many people that Charles had told about his fantasies. Now, he told the doctor in much more detail. He'd only made passing comments to friends in the past, but to the doctor, he was very specific. And if you go back and listen, or if you were listening closely to that letter I read earlier, he wrote that letter and he said it in a way that makes it seem like he was trying to tell the doctor how he was feeling and that he was asking for help. I hope someone else caught that. He definitely, in that letter, made it seem like he was asking the doctor for help. And unfortunately, the doctor didn't see enough of a reason to tell anyone about it. Now, I have a feeling a lot of people are going to say that this is his fault. Now, I would say it's partially his fault for sure, and definitely something should have been done about that. But I do want to know what you guys think about that. So Charles's body was autopsied, and the doctors found a small tumor on his brain. This has led many people to debate for years on whether or not the tumor caused this to happen. But pretty much all medical professionals that have studied this case or that know anything about it say that probably not. The tumor probably did not have much of a cause for this. It was everything else that we've already discussed in this case. Charles was buried next to his mother in Florida with an American flag over his coffin, as he was a Marine. So yeah, this case is crazy, obviously. Thank you for listening to this. I couldn't go into every single detail of every single injury or murder in this case, partially because I don't think YouTube would allow it without striking the video for some reason, and I am at the mercy of YouTube, as most of you know. But I went into some of them, and I think it's important to remember the victims in the case like this. And this is one of the earliest types of, I'm not going to say the words because for sure it will get flagged, but it's one of the earliest cases like this. Nowadays, unfortunately, I'm not trying to make this political, but unfortunately, if this happened next week, none of us would be surprised. It's a very unfortunate thing, but at the time, this had never really happened in America. I mean, obviously, much worse things had happened, but this was a very, from what I've seen, a pretty unique case. I think there's other stuff like it, but back in the 60s, it didn't happen like it does today. And that really, it really sucks that it happens more often now. It's very, very sad. But thank you for listening to this. Subscribe if you like it. I'm not begging you, as some people have said in the comments, but if you like our stuff, we release videos every week. Subscribe if you want. We have a Patreon for $3 a month. Honestly, this video will probably be demonetized, and that's the reason we have a Patreon. If you want to help us, if you want to help keep the channel going, it means just so much for us. About half of our videos are demonetized. And like the Paris episode was demonetized, and that hurts. But it's great that it got so much attention, and I really appreciate everyone being here. So thank you very much for being here. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I missed and maybe you want to discuss it. Let me know about anything you want to talk about. I really love having conversations with you and also just reading your conversations. Thank you very much. I'm out.
Must be destroyed.